Pip's sister married Joe Gargery, the blacksmith. And since their parents and all the other siblings were dead, Pip's sister took him to live with them. Maybe she cared for her much younger brother, but it's hard to tell since she mistreats him a lot. And in the story, Great Expectations by Dickens, of course, we never hear her speak a good word of or to him. She's a bitter young woman who is forever complaining and bullying both the boy and her husband. Joe's easygoing, a good man in the richest sense of the word. And he's the boy's dearest friend. And he makes his life easier and bearable. Pip looked forward to the day when he would be Joe's apprentice at the smithy. And Joe shared his feelings because, as Joe was always putting it, he and the boy was ever the best of friends. And they'd be having such larks. In the meantime, Pip helped around the forge, usually covered in soot and cinders. His heavy and clumsy boots took a beating. His hands were becoming rough, like his friend Joe's. This was life, and the boy loved it. Working and being around Joe, I mean. Well, it came to pass for some unknown reason the boys invited to a Miss Havisham's big old house. An offer he couldn't refuse since his sister wouldn't hear tell of him refusing. And that's when he met a girl of his own age, the very pretty Estella, the adopted daughter of Miss Havisham. Havisham, who was a hater of men, because one jilted her hours before the wedding that was to take place on her birthday. In addition to that, he had been using her all along. Right from the start, Estella treated Pip scandalously and repeatedly reminded him that he was stupid, clumsy, and a labouring boy. The girl Pip so badly wanted to impress was heartless and ashamed of him. And soon he was ashamed of himself. While playing cards, she sneered, "He calls knaves jacks, this boy. Look at his coarse hands. And look at those thick boots." Pip confesses to the reader, "I'd never thought of being ashamed of my hands before, but I began to consider them a very indifferent pair." Her contempt for me was so strong that it became infectious, and I caught it. And the contagion spread. While he waited outside like a dog to be fed, he had a long look at his hands and boots, and he admits, "My opinion of these was not favourable. They'd never troubled me before, but they troubled me now as vulgar appendages." I was determined to ask Joe why he had ever taught me to call those picture cards jacks when they ought to have been called knaves. I wish Joe had been rather more genteelly brought up, and then I should have been so too. The infection deepened. Later, when the simple and good-hearted man was required to go with him to Miss Havisham's, Pip was embarrassed at his appearance and his way of speaking. Much later still, when Joe showed up at Pip's London flat apartment, having gone very much out of his way to do his friend a service, the young man's first fear, he confesses, is that any of his friends should see Joe. He finds it difficult to give him a civil, much less a warm greeting, and when Joe, because Pip is now a gentleman, you see, when Joe takes too much trouble in wiping his feet before entering the apartment, Pip's irritation with the poor man who raised him and now seeks to do him a great service at great cost to himself, his irritation and embarrassment spills over, and he virtually drags the man into the house. So well written, so true to life. The entire matter is painful to read, and it must cut and convict a host of us. In stark contrast to all that, and in a few words, 2 Timothy 1:15 to 18 gives us a picture of a man called Onesiphorus, or something like that. Here's the text. You know that everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me, says Paul, including Phygelus and Hermogenes. May the Lord show mercy to the household of Onesiphorus, because he often refreshed me and he wasn't ashamed of my chains. On the contrary, when he was in Rome, he searched hard for me until he found me. You know very well in how many ways he helped me in Ephesus. There was Phygelus and Hermogenes and Pip. But there was also Onesiphorus. Many years ago in America, I used to visit an assembly as regularly as clockwork. I always found it a source of joy and encouragement. The treatment wasn't lavish or saccharine, but there was a genuineness in the warmth and kindness with which I was treated, and I couldn't mistake that. It led me to say to one of the shepherds there, I do believe if I ever truly and publicly shamed myself, that I'd still find a welcome here. I was immediately and smilingly embraced and given the assurance that that was so. It's wonderful to imagine Onesiphorus searching all over Rome, asking here, there, and yonder at the various prisons and official centers how he could find a Jewish man called Saul of Tarsus. He refused to be discouraged in his search, and when he found Paul, the chains meant absolutely nothing to him. Paul, now in prison for the last time, he would have let his mind roam over many things, and from a host of experiences and memories, Paul reaches in and takes out this one that he feels must be included in his very last letter. He remembers and thanks God for a man who refused to be ashamed of him. People like that are the cure for the infection Pip and others catch and spread. Oscar Wilde could never rank high as a fine human. And while he could whine and blame others for the trouble he found himself in, he also had it in him to confess this: I ruined myself. In his De Profundis, written while in Reading jail, and which I take to be true and sincere, even if there's plenty of self-pity in it. In De Profundis, Wilde tells us this: a great friend of mine, a friend of 10 years standing, came to see me some time ago and told me that he did not believe a single word of what was said against me. And he wished me to know that he considered me quite innocent and the victim of a hideous plot. I burst into tears at what he said, and I told him that while there was much amongst the definite charges that was quite untrue and transferred to me by revolting malice, still, my life had been full of perverse pleasures, and that unless he accepted that as a fact about me and realized it to the full, I couldn't possibly be friends with him anymore or ever be in his company. It was a terrible shock to him, but we are friends. And I've not got his friendship on false pretenses. I have said to you, to speak the truth is a painful thing. To be forced to tell lies is much worse. Prison was utter agony for Wilde, and being used to life as a dandy, and one courted by high society. The entire experience of a public trial on charges of moral corruption, indecency, and of corrupting others made him writhe inside. Understandably, many who oohed and awed over him in his glory days vanished when his sordid behavior was paraded before the world, when in his arrogance he insisted on a public showdown with the Marquis or the Marquis of Queensberry. The courteous and soft treatment he had become used to was in savage contrast to his being roughly shoved here and there in handcuffs, along with the common criminals, in and out of dismal rooms and stinking cells. It was in the early days when the nightmare was at its agonizing worst that this happened. He tells us, while there's sorrow, there's holy ground. Someday people will realize what that means. When I was brought down from my prison to the court of bankruptcy between two policemen, then he alludes to a friend he doesn't name at this point. While I was being brought down to the court of bankruptcy between two policemen, it turns out to be Robbie. Robbie waited in the long, dreary corridor so that before the whole crowd, who were silenced by his action, so that he might gravely raise his hat to me, as handcuffed and with bowed head I passed him by. Men have gone to heaven for smaller things than that. It was in this spirit and with this mode of love that the saints knelt down to wash the feet of the poor or stopped to kiss the leper on the cheek. I've never said one single word to him about what he did. I don't know to the present moment whether he is aware that I was even conscious of his action. It's not a thing for which one can render formal thanks and formal words. I store it in the treasure house of my heart. I keep it as a secret debt that I am glad to think I can never possibly repay. When wisdom has been profitless to me, philosophy barren, and the proverbs and phrases of those who have sought to give me consolation are like dust and ashes in my mouth, the memory of that little, lovely, silent act of love has unsealed for me all the wells of pity, made the desert blossom like a rose, and brought me out of the bitterness of lonely exile into harmony with the wounded, broken, and great heart of the world. A man steps out from the crowd that lines the corridor into the middle of the corridor in front of the prisoner, the guilty, shamed prisoner, handcuffed between two policemen. And he solemnly raises his hat in respect. Lovely scene, that. And what about Pip in Dickens's book? Sometime later, Pip's expectations go into a steep decline from which they never really recover, and he becomes ill for a long time. A deep sense of guilt hangs over him for the way he's treated the convict Abel Magwitch, who was his benefactor, and especially Joe. And it drives him to despair. In his shame and illness, he loses consciousness, only to waken in Joe's house with Joe at the bedside looking after him. For months. Joe, Robbie, Onesiphorus, maybe you are all the cure for one of the world's awful infections. To find yourself named, or not named, but there, in someone's final word to the world, and to discover that the little you did meant so much. Surely that would be a precious thing to know as you come to the end of your own days. Makes you want to be unashamed, doesn't it? So, what now?